Welcome! In this video, we'll explore how the state of North Carolina and the city of Charlotte got to where we are today in terms of racial disparity. Many factors and forces have played a role in this journey. However, this video will focus on three key areas, namely housing, education, and civil rights. It took a series of conscious decisions spanning decades to turn Charlotte into an almost entirely segregated community, and their consequences still echo today. To begin this story, we'll roll back the timeline 357 years to the early days of our state. Slavery was present in North Carolina from its inception as a colony in 1663. The colonial slave population was mainly concentrated in the eastern part of the colony, where a relatively small number of wealthy planters established plantations reliant on slave labor. White settlers in the backcountry of colonial North Carolina lacked the economic means to procure large numbers of enslaved persons. One exception to this was Lotta Plantation, which prospered through cotton raising during the early 1800s. James Lotta and Jane Knox Lotta owned the property and expanded it into a plantation, building the Federal-style home on the property in 1800. In the year the home was built, James Lotta owned 2 slaves, and by 1830, that number had grown to 34, including 23 adults and 11 children. Slavery lay at the foundation of North Carolina society and was foundational to the colony's economy. Much of eastern North Carolina fell under Union occupation early in the Civil War. When black men were permitted to enlist in the Union Army after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, they set up schools in the Army barracks. Yet the threat of local white backlash remained very real. In May 1862, military Governor Edward Stanley ordered black schools in New Bern to close, citing state slave codes forbidding teaching blacks to read or write. The schools were closed, but later reopened. In 1864, 3 white men set fire to a black schoolhouse and threatened the female teacher with violence unless she promised to never again teach black people to read. The post-Civil War Reconstruction period witnessed the affirmation on paper of the rights of African Americans, many of them newly freed from slavery in the South. 3 amendments to the United States Constitution declared their rights as American citizens. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment recognized blacks as citizens and outlined basic rights. And the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. Resentment grew in whites at the thought of standing side by side with former slaves who were now allowed to earn wages, hold positions of leadership, and own land. The 1890s were a rough time for the economy in our state, nearly as bad as the Great Depression, as North Carolina remained deeply agricultural. And Charlotte followed a similar pattern of segregation that many southern cities experienced following the Reconstruction era. Political leaders used the state election of 1898 to further divide North Carolina on the basis of race in order to regain political power, resulting in increased racial violence. Later that year, during the 1898 Wilmington race riot, armed white men burned black businesses and forced a number of African American leaders out of the city. According to records, at least 60 and perhaps more blacks were killed and 25 were wounded, and 3 white men were killed in the riot. This massacre further fueled an ongoing statewide disenfranchisement campaign designed to crush black political power. Racial fear-mongering dominated political discussion and had immediate impact. North Carolina followed the lead of other southern states in passing a series of laws that segregated or separated African Americans from whites. In 1896, the first separate waiting rooms appeared in Charlotte train stations. In 1900, North Carolina, modeling the actions of other southern states, passed a suffrage amendment to the state constitution that prevented most African Americans from voting. In 1903, Independence Park became closed to black residents, and by 1910, There were clear black and white neighborhoods in Charlotte's uptown, and separate water fountains for white and colored people appeared in City Hall. North Carolina set up a system of segregated education that ranged from elementary school through the university level. African Americans, many of whom were poor, understood that a better life was built on a foundation of better education. They also understood that segregated education helped to maintain a separate society. African Americans started private academies to educate their children and collaborated with private foundations to establish schools. There were several schools for undergraduate higher education for African Americans in the state, such as Shaw University and the State Normal and Training School for Blacks, which is now Elizabeth City State University. However, no graduate or professional schools for African Americans existed in North Carolina. Nevertheless, in the early 1900s, the gap between black and white public education in North Carolina increased dramatically. From 1904 to 1920, annual spending per white school averaged $3,442, but only averaged $500 for black schools. This environment of segregation was also finding its way into housing in a more prominent way. In the early 1900s, neighborhoods began to develop catering to three classes: affluent whites in Myers Park, poor whites in Noda, and African Americans in Brooklyn, in what is now Second Ward's government district. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the mortgage market dried up. The federal government began color-coding neighborhoods so out-of-town investors would be able to assess credit risk for making loans in particular areas. As you can imagine, 1930s era policies were not race blind. White neighborhoods were green-lighted for loans. Black neighborhoods were literally outlined in red, meaning a bad investment. Federal redlining prohibited black families from getting loans to buy a home, leading to low rates of home ownership that persist today. This set the stage for policies and outlooks that not only deepened economic divides in the Charlotte and Mecklenburg area, but engendered deep divisions based upon race as well. As the nation emerged from the Great Depression and World War II, the issues of race and educational equality again came to the forefront. The spring of 1954 was a social and legal watershed moment in United States history. Since the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, which paved the way for Jim Crow and segregation, the separate but equal doctrine had ruled the South. But in May 1954, the United States Supreme Court overturned the Plessy decision in Brown versus Board of Education, stating that, in terms of public education, schools separated by race were inherently unequal and violated black children's 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. However, the court declared no timeline for integration, only saying states should do so with all deliberate speed. Such vague language gave North Carolina segregationists the green light to stall integration, and the road to end segregation was far from over. White resistance would continue to stall integration in North Carolina and throughout the South. By 1957, only 3 school districts in North Carolina, Charlotte, Greensboro, and Winston-Salem, agreed to send a small number of black students to all-white schools. Sending white children to black schools was out of the question. These were the first instances of voluntary desegregation in the former Confederate states. And although the state persevered, its reputation for racial progressivism, largely because no schools closed in response to desegregation, as opposed to states like Virginia, when black student Dorothy Counts walked towards the all-white Harding High School, she was met with stones, spit, and racial slurs. Local civil rights activist Reginald Hawkins escorted Counts out of school at day's end out of fear for her safety, where they were once again subject to a shower of spittle, pebbles, and sticks. They tore our clothes, and the police just stood there and did nothing. A week later, Dorothy Counts was gone. Her parents, having been told by the school administrators and police officials that they could not guarantee her safety, sent her to live with a relative in suburban Philadelphia, where she could peacefully attend an integrated school. By 1960, only 3 black Charlotte students had been admitted into white schools. In the 1950s and 1960s, federal funding came to Charlotte-Mecklenburg for the purpose of demolishing neighborhoods in the name of urban renewal. The Second Ward's Brooklyn neighborhood, consisting of 1,400 homes and over 215 black-owned businesses, was demolished and no replacement housing provided. The entire community was disrupted. Subsequently, urban renewal targeted Greenville, the northwest of uptown Charlotte, and a large portion of First Ward, both African American neighborhoods as well. Displaced individuals from Brooklyn and other leveled areas were pushed to the northwest and central parts of the city into working class neighborhoods such as Belmont, Wesley Heights, and Biddleville, where Johnson C. Smith University is located. White flight ensued. In 1971, the Supreme Court found in Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools that school districts could use busing to implement desegregation in public schools. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system quickly became a desegregation model for districts around the country, producing a school district that was both well integrated and produced strong student outcomes. In stark contrast to violent and deadly riots in Boston over busing, Charlotte was widely known as the city that made desegregation work, and it seemed the promise of Brown might finally be realized in Mecklenburg County. But even as Charlotte schools gained racial balance, black students were bused more often and for longer distances than white students. In response to increasing desegregation, white families began moving to suburban school districts or enrolling their children in private schools. The rosy period of integration didn't last. A 1997 ruling appeared to take a step toward racial and economic equality. In the Hoke County Board of Education versus State, the court found the state constitution did not require all school districts to receive equal funding, but that every student had the right to a sound basic education, and schools in economically poor areas must receive additional funding. Charlotte-Mecklenburg returned to a neighborhood school model, leading to the current state of public school resegregation mirroring our housing patterns. Despite the city's makeover, Charlotte remains extremely segregated. In 2013, with a county population of a little over 1 million people, approximately 147,000 students were enrolled at CMS. Of that student population, 39% was black, 29% white, 23% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. This chart of CMS high school students in the prior year shows similar numbers. Over half of all African American students attend schools that are 90% non-white, and the majority of white students attend majority white schools. A March 2018 Newsweek article claims, quote, "In Charlotte, in 2018, like most other American cities, schools are nearly as segregated as they were before the 1954 Supreme Court decision of Brown." End quote. In CMS schools with the greatest percentage of white students, 82% of third graders read at or above grade level. Proficiency drops to 59% at the balanced campuses and to just under 29% at the ones with the highest concentration of black students. Today, Charlotte's housing market has resulted in a separate and unequal neighborhood geography. The pattern is unambiguous: a wedge of predominantly white, wealthy neighborhoods to the south and southeast of Charlotte that is similarly represented in our northern towns. In contrast, The crescent of lower opportunity neighborhoods of color wraps around our center city. As demand for housing closer into the urban core grows and gentrification continues to drive up housing prices, many lower income people of color in the crescent are being pushed out to older suburban neighborhoods where they can find more affordable housing. And that, folks, is a summary of how we got to where we are today in the state of North Carolina and the city of Charlotte. Thank you for your time, and I hope you found this video to be informative.